Thank you, Gabrielle. I'll now welcome Matthew Clarke to the stage.
There's a garden party. I'm going to be really brief. We have one more wonderful person. Um, there's a lot of people in this room who've been also people on the stage. There are also people who are not on the stage and are not in this room who need to be part of this conversation. And this is the beginning of that, we hope. We hope we can encourage that kind of conversation. As part of this event, we've asked other New Yorkers about big ideas for the city, and we want to hear that from you as well. I think you can log on to Slido and start to contribute to that. But we asked some experts, and expertise is actually an interesting question, what that means. We all are experts, New Yorkers are experts in what they do. Things about a biophilic city, a city that has a community resilience map. A New York City that has a zoning code for health. What does that mean? We had actually a couple people independently talk about open streets, open school streets, which is fascinating. Open streets in general, what does streets mean? We've heard about that today. Care-based alternatives to incarceration. We heard this morning, New York City needs to keep cool. It is a cool city, but we also fundamentally, for our livelihoods, need to be cool, and everyone deserves that right. We need to protect Black culture, to give vacant lots new life, and equitable arts access. And there's more. We have more contributors. There are more people. But what is your big idea? I think we have a Slido something up, but we want to hear from you in this room, at least 2 big ideas. So as you're thinking about that, what's a big idea for New York? We're going to continue to collect this, and we'd love to hear from you after this, during this. Daylight subway stations. Wow, that's an interesting one. But we want to hear from you either now in this moment or afterwards. We understand this is a conversation that needs to continue in many ways. I'm going to wait for a couple more. So there's no garden party until there's at least 2 more ideas. 2 more ideas. Built for people, by the people, pedestrian, more voices, outer boroughs. The outer boroughs is the worst term. They are the boroughs, and we're here in Manhattan. Free therapy, public space, bike infrastructure, absolutely. I see some faces in the room too. I'm wondering if I can place these, I'm not gonna try. All right, we'll keep going, and this conversation can clean some, okay. I know who wrote that one, I'm not gonna call them out. Health is Department of Care, absolutely. Connected Greenways, engaged. We have a great panel. We can start that engagement. Keep typing, but again, I don't want to hog the stage. Free buses, Ransar. We have a Ransar. I want to thank you all today for starting this conversation and being part of it in a really meaningful way. Connect with us, find ways to engage. Tell us how we need to correct. Tell us who's not in this room who needs to be, what voice is not part of this conversation. But thank you all for being part of it in a small way. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, last but not least, who's gonna read a bit from an upcoming book. Also a dear friend of mine, Shayla Lawson.
Hello, everybody. So this is actually kind of lovely. As Matthew mentioned, this is a piece out of a book for me that's forthcoming that's called How to Live Free in a Dangerous World. And the chapter on New York is about my experience of having to leave New York when I became a disabled person, because a lot of these conversations weren't happening in the way that I'm so excited to see happening here. And so I'm just going to read it. And the title of this chapter is On Love. I love New York. The first time I ever said this, I was coming out of a subway stop for the 456 at Grand Central Terminal. It was hot, October, and I was headed to a tiny fellowship at an even smaller desk at the Fifth Avenue New York Library, the one with the lions out front. Despite its being my second time living in New York City. Up until then, I'd only thought of it through the lens of my own early childhood memories of The Wiz and Sesame Street. I said, I love New York noiselessly under my breath, frequently in that first year of my return to the city. The words felt as good as a first crush. I was lonely and missing someone. The hole in my heart felt big enough to stick my whole hand through it. I had friends in the city, wonderful ones, but I was constantly aware of what I could be doing in New York. Partying, looking fabulous, rubbing elbows with celebrities, every moment covered in other people's glitter, versus what I was actually doing. Going out occasionally, mostly to rooftops, cute dinners, the opera, or experimental theater. This awareness filled me with fear that it was my boringness, my solitude, that made me not enough for him. He only lived in Brooklyn, and we'd rendezvoused pretty adorably for several months while I was back and forth between Portland and Manhattan, until I got a job that brought me back to East Coast living, at which point he stopped returning my messages. That had been spring. By summer, we ran into each other on the platform of a broke-down AC subway line on Fulton when I was scrambling to make it back to a Hinge date. It's such a New York story. You get ghosted and then you see the dude on the tracks while the train's broken. Yeah. And it gets more New York. That's the fun part. I was standing on the platform trying to get 2 bars of cell phone service. The train came in and his car opened. For a brief moment, he stood there looking at me like he loved me. So, of course, I said something dumb. "It's Shayla," I said, snapping my fingers as if to say snap out of it. In truth, the way he ghosted me, the way being left on read by him haunted me, lived with me, made me truly worried that he'd forgotten my name. He looked me up and down. I realized I looked pretty. We dated in fall and winter. He'd never seen me summer dressed. He walked onto the platform. We flirted and made small talk about the book he was reading on cryptocurrency, because Brooklyn. Like, everybody has dated this Brooklyn chick. It's funny because I haven't thought about this story in a while, and I'm like, dang, this is the very specific periodic Brooklyn. Anyway, I pulled the book out of his hands. "You know I write these, don't you?" Of course he did. In fact, he'd come to my last book's debut reading in Dumbo when we were still canoodling. I texted him telling him to bring his wildest friend, and he did. His wildest friend and my wildest friend, and then the 2 of us went out for cocktails afterwards. That night, on his couch after we spooned for 2 hours watching the screening edit of an upcoming Android film, I kissed his softly snoring mouth. He woke to kiss me, his hairy belly, which I loved, maybe considerably more than him. And he asked if we could keep our relationship more casual. I thumbed through the book on the train platform. He looked at me puzzled. "Where are you headed?" he asked. The train conductors were trying to screech the engine back to life. I hemmed and hawed. I wanted to be coy, but my heart beat too fast beside him to lie. He moved his messenger bag, and it was so close in front of me, our light jackets touched. "Out to meet a friend. I'm headed to dinner?" He smiled, just as coy as I couldn't be. He kissed me, and the train whirred back to life, catching my dress in the wind of its engine. He held his arms around my waist. "Have fun," he said, hopping back on the train before it beat on. And of course, I absolutely could not. By October, I wasn't missing him as much as I was missing that I could be loved by him and wasn't. And it was only by virtue of something that I was, that I wasn't. I didn't know what the was, but I knew I felt it often now in New York City. I had the people I loved who loved me, but I was doing a terrible job at enamoring anybody new. For friendships or otherwise, I'd have this weird, short dalliance relationship, meeting interesting people at bars, us promising to call each other afterward, but that was something that we'd never do. "You're very West Coast," people would tell me often, which was funny to me because I rarely told people I'd moved from Portland, Oregon, and I had only lived there for 3 years. I'd given up heels for Jordans. Was that the tell? I think what they were referring to was my pie-eyed openness, my excitement for new encounters. Everyone I met was moving back to the city, who was moving back to the city was distrustful of my eagerness. But I've always been like that. When I lived in New York for the first time in my mid to late 20s, I used to run around town in this I Love Kentucky t-shirt. I wore it ironically, but it just happened to have the sentiment that I shared in spades. In one of my favorite pictures of me from 2008, I'm at a Harlem house party and paused for a moment from dancing the floorboards down in a pre-war apartment when the neighbors downstairs knocked a broomstick against their ceiling in the break while we were switching tracks, telling us to keep it down. I'm wearing big square purple glasses. They've completely fogged up. And in the moment where my friend snaps a picture of me in the half blown out flash of an actual digital camera, my t-shirt twisted in a way where the K in my confessional t-shirt looks like an N. No matter how New York I looked, Kentucky was what I was. And I was so green and gullible that the story all my Harlem friends told to introduce me was from the time a wild-looking man in a trench coat standing on the West 4th Street basketball courts downtown had forcibly tried to sell me a rolled paper sack filled with white Gap cotton thongs. Underwear. And it wasn't the fact that it happened that made them laugh. It was the fact that I seemed to them the most likely sucker to buy a bag of something I didn't want from a pushy man in the streets just to be nice. Kentucky. That was the nickname one of my new friends from the Bronx gave me. I loved it. I kept hoping her nickname would stick. It seemed to upend the uneasiness I felt about how guileless I was at every turn in a city that needed beguiling. Love is different than being in love. I'm an abundant overlover, but being in love is something I was bad at. I moved around so many times, and I've lost so many people. I just want some constancy and certainty. I can't stand the catch and release. And falling in love with New York is a very particular type of unrequited love. She is grimy and overstretched, but beautiful and powerful. And the kind of people like falling in love with in New York share that dichotomy of vision and dysfunction. Like, I knew the minute I met the kind of woman the train platform man could be with. It was at an after party to a winter party that he had thrown. She was 5'2" and energetic. She had an impressive but uninteresting job. She'd recently been broken again. We have all met this couple. May they still be together. She had recently been broken up with and had just moved into her first single girl studio. But the confidence she projected over plastic cup cocktails, enviable. Impeccable. I listened to her talk for probably about half an hour about how quickly she would find another boyfriend and how happy she was to be on to the next. She was pretty, but not leaning in either direction where I'd add an adjective to it. In short, she was no more extraordinary than I could have been to the right imagination. But in her power of projecting past her circumstances, past all the insecurity that is possible, she was a force of sheer will. What she knew that I refused to learn is that falling in love is about building a mythology around who you really are. Falling in love is a surface. Don't you worry about starting over? I asked her, fascinated. I'd started over far too many times, but I was excited to hear what a girl I couldn't be might say. She shrugged, unruffled. The boys will take care of me, she said, gesturing around the crowded bar to the boy I was in love with and his friends. They've already been so great to me. She said that part so honestly, so sweetly, and calling in love a surface, I'm not saying it lacks any real charm or honesty. Each surface has its own texture, depth, and quality, but at some point this wears off. I envision this as the reason so many people I meet in New York describes relationships as a process of falling in love, only to realize that the person they fell in love with isn't the same as the person they dated. I don't feel pity for these people, even under the best of circumstances. Theirs is a completely unreasonable expectation. But I think New Yorkers are more prone to expect a person they love will maintain the pretense of being unlovable much longer than anywhere else because that person has the city, sexy, unyielding, and confident to compete with. I didn't move out of New York because I stopped loving her. I moved out of New York because the thing people don't advertise is there is always a time in which those New York relationships, there is always a time in New York relationships where you have to make a choice between your life or hers. And you know, no matter what, they will keep going. And there will always be somebody who needs beguiling, even if you're not it. During the fall of 2020, at the height of the pandemic year, where my penchant for care in the form of pies left on doorsteps and goofy text messages made me a bit of a community asset, I started to lose my legs. My right or left knee would dislocate without warning. And though this was manageable in a New York world where no one was walking much, I knew by November that New York in all her mass vulnerabilities couldn't handle my growing ones. November was the first and last time I felt brave enough to navigate the New York City subways by myself during COVID-19 on my unreliable appendages. I winced at every flight of subway stairs I'd stomped up easily in 2008, often skipping to work back then or out afterward in one of my clearanced Century 21 Jimmy Choos. I struggled to find the signs that pointed to accessible access points for train cars, the elevators, only to realize that the walk was often twice as long to the stairs than the stairs were to get up. I had to rest and hold on to things because I didn't look physically impaired, but was obviously struggling in the COVID era, no less. A few people stared at me. The staring, a New York first. One of the best things the city had had to offer had always been how it cultivated anonymity and density, like a loud house party. I found the subway elevator. I entered it. "Excuse me, miss, this woman needs help." It was a Dominican gentleman who was guiding an older woman who spoke no English onto the closing doors. She was a stranger to both him and me. That's another thing that in New York feels like a beautiful party, the occasional bouts of complete unselfish kindness from total strangers. She was trying to get up the stairs as I was, but as soon as we'd stepped onto the platform, she'd realized the train she needed was in the opposite direction. "Help me," she said, strong but diminutive. I winced, but I did. Walked her back to the elevator, which we took down, and walked a train's length to the next elevator, which put her in the right direction and put me totally off of my path. I was tired and in so much pain, I can't even remember if I made it to my neurology appointment to check if what was going on with my legs was a product of my brain malfunctioning. I must have. I love New York. I love New York, but unless you're equipped with an abundant amount of wealth, status, or physical ability, it is an almost untenable city. Because so often, she does not contribute to those wells of health you are trying to build in order to maintain a relationship with her. Instead, she only takes them. I've dated dysfunctional people. I've dated people who've dated dysfunctional people. And in every version of the tales we tell of being in love with those loves, I hear, "But I love her." There is a certain intoxication that comes with falling in love with someone, a person, a city that has all of the enchantment in the world, but absolutely none of its home training. We feel emboldened by the fact that we persevere. It makes us feel we're better people than the people who have loved and left. It means we are stronger, more ordained. But the one thing being loved and being in love hold in common is that both require reciprocity in their truth. Although it never feels right to say this amid metropolitan circles, New York, in all her glamour and culture, all her poverty and corruption, is too narcissistic to love any of us back. I love how Alison Bechdel puts it. Narcissism is a wound. Because I think of the myth of Narcissus and how he was so consumed with the wound of his self-obsession, he could not see that the beauty reflected back at him in an empty well was entirely his own. I think this is what New Yorkers miss. That when we say, "I love New York," we operate from the lofty feeling that she has given us beauty, given us meaning. What is our own creativity, our own resilience, our own perseverance and patience that keep her alive in the first place? When I first moved to the city in 2008, that was the thing about this place that shocked me the most. The number of people who wore like a badge of honor the siege that New York City had wrought upon them. Homelessness, debt, bad lungs from poor air quality, fallen arches from the strain of pretty or improper shoes put on our feet. That's the in love part. We carry the torch of her mythology, that if we can't look past these things about her, we're shit out of luck finding happiness anywhere else. I didn't move out of New York because I stopped loving her. I moved out of New York because the thing people don't advertise about what this city does is that there's always going to be a time in courting where you have to decide between your life and hers. Before Narcissus was a wound, he was a flower, a daffodil, a symbol of life and rebirth and new beginnings. And those are the kinds of organisms that we are. Lifetime New Yorkers sacrificed themselves to the adoration of her, her hells and high waters, but I couldn't. Years after I left New York, I read in Time magazine that in a post-pandemic era, 60% of America's population has been diagnosed as chronically ill. That includes 60% of New York's 8.5 million people, the disabled of New York City alone constituting 4% of America's overall population. When I remember us hobbling into the subway desperately searching for elevators, being shoved and called a bitch or other names for moving slower than the rest of the city, I understand why I felt for so long so unlovable. It wasn't just who I was. It was what I represented in all of us. The admission that imperfection is real, that being impervious to my fragile body is impossible, unnecessary, unhealthy. Because no matter what, New York will keep loving without me. There will always be someone who needs her beguiling. What happened to the boy, you ask? Well, I'm glad you did. Regretfully, I walked around carrying that heart-shaped hole in my heart for at least another year, plugging it occasionally with my fist or other people's kisses. We ran into each other in Mexico City a few days before New Year's. "Hey," said his Serbian Brooklyn buddy, "only in New York." The boy looked excited to see me, but also nervous. The two of them were on a double date with two women they'd just met the night before. I'll skip the details, but I ended up tagging along, a fifth wheel. By the end of the night, it was just him and the two of us outside taking a look at the view of the apartment that he'd rented. The whole skyscraper of CDMX, it lit up like New York City. The girl was wearing a black spaghetti-strap dress, and it was too cold for her to stand outside long. He lit a cigarette, and I stood beside him wrapped in my fabulous October sweater. "So," said the boy. We talked. I only committed the last line he said to memory. Even my therapist years later would remark that it sounded so terribly earnest. "I'm just afraid I'm gonna go back in there and disappoint her." And in that moment, I knew what I was to do. As in, I knew what I was meant to do. I recalled the pretty woman I'd met at his after party. I thought of how tiny town that she was. She towered over me by the sheer metropolis of her will and her presence. I was supposed to be that. I was supposed to walk off the porch and into the living room and tell that girl this night was no longer hers and he belonged to me. If I had, I sometimes think maybe we'd be together right now. Maybe we'd be buying each other plants and cozying up on his couch, and I'd never write these words because I'd be too busy with us making love to each other. And I finally would have become a New York girl, but I didn't want to. I called an Uber. I asked the boy to walk me out. He was trying to finish our conversation as he escorted me down the stairs, saying how proud he was of all he'd seen me do since we'd met, and how I was about to blow up like so many friends of his in New York had over the years. But the tears in the back of my eyes were burning too fast for me to turn around or to let him catch up, and this is why I consider myself an unlovable girl, because stopping the hurt is the only time I'm built to put a facade up. By the time we'd walk the 4 flights down to my Uber, I was composed and cool, all the parts of me that loved him suffocating in the car's trunk. I told him to hit me up when his trip was over, which he never did. And with the pandemic starting soon after the new year began, I never saw him again. He wrapped himself around me in a way that made me mush, both his arms at the base of my waist, like that day on the C train. But this time he didn't let go. As he did, he heard the ding of the moving subway train. He kissed me. And I tried to pull away. I tried thinking about what he would do soon with that same mouth, but I slid into it. Then I pulled the handle of the car door, opened it just quick enough so I didn't have to slide myself right back into trouble. "This is one of my most favorite girls in the world," he told the cab driver in inebriated American Spanish. "Be careful with her, or you answer to me," he said. I rolled my eyes. But before I stepped into the car, he hugged me one last time and said to me the only thing I'd been waiting for New York to say to me after so many years: "I love you." The best thing in the world he ever did for me was that he didn't. Thank you.